Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we'll be covering how a training program will differ when training for strength versus hypertrophy. First, we need to define what the goal of strength and hypertrophy actually means. First, let's explore what the term strength specifically refers to. Strength is essentially the act of lifting maximal weights for one rep in a given exercise. And this is specific to that exercise that the trainee is seeking to become strong at. For example, a powerlifter aims to be strong at the squat, bench press, and deadlift exercises. However, a weightlifter may want to become stronger at the front squat to transfer to the snatch and clean and jerk. So neither of these athletes is stronger than the other, they can simply lift heavier weights in the specific movement they are training for. So when referring to strength training, we need to be very specific with what exercise we want to be strong at. Now that we understand what strength is, let's explore exactly what hypertrophy is. Rather than a performance-based goal, hypertrophy is a structural adaptation of the muscle. It refers to an increase in the size of the muscle as a result of training. This means that more contractile units actually grow inside the muscle fibers, making each muscle fiber bigger, and increasing the total diameter of the overall muscle. Since these are two different adaptations, the training required to achieve each outcome is different. It should be noted that these are not completely opposing adaptations, and there is certainly overlap between each quality. However, we are going to discuss how to train in order to best target each quality. Let's now explore each training variable and how this differs between strength and hypertrophy training. The first training variable that we will compare is exercise selection. Exercise selection is extremely important for strength performance. This is because maximal strength is specific to the lift we want to get stronger at. The less similar a movement is to the competition lift, the less transfer it will have to performance. For example, training with the back squat is going to directly transfer to back squat performance if performed in an appropriate manner. Although training a leg press may have very limited transfer to back squat performance, even though similar muscle groups are used. Put simply, we need to train the exercise that we want to become stronger at. However, for hypertrophy adaptations, exercise selection is much less important. This is because we are simply aiming to apply stress to the muscle. We are not trying to ingrain a specific movement pattern. So choosing exercises which target the muscles we are trying to grow is the primary concern. The exact exercises chosen for each muscle group should be based on a few factors. These are joint tolerance. This refers to the fact that most people feel joint pain or discomfort performing certain exercises, even with appropriate technique. So selecting exercises which don't irritate the joints is the first concern. The next consideration is compound versus isolation exercises. Although it probably doesn't matter to any significant degree as to whether all of your volume comes from either compound or isolation exercises, it may still be best to perform a combination of the two. This is because performing all compound lifts may increase the risk of joint injury since much heavier loads are used. On the other hand, performing only isolation exercises means that many more exercises need to be performed to accumulate the same volume for each muscle group. This is because compound lifts will train multiple muscles simultaneously, while isolation lifts will only target one or two muscle groups during the movement. And the last consideration is individual anatomy and preferences. Some people are simply built better for certain exercises and enjoy them more. For example, shorter-legged trainees may find it much more comfortable to perform deep squats, while longer-legged trainees may prefer a leg press. Furthermore, some people simply enjoy certain exercises more and are much more likely to put in high effort doing something they enjoy. Moving on now to our next training variable, we have volume. The effect of volume on strength performance is somewhat complicated. A certain level of exposure to the specific lift will allow the trainee to become efficient at the exercise, but more than that may not provide much more additional benefit. In this study, high volumes were clearly associated with greater hypertrophy, although max strength was increased equally well with as little as 3 sets per exercise per week. However, this was only an 8-week study and the long-term responses aren't clear. Generally, greater volumes may be required at certain times throughout the training cycle. This is because higher volumes will provide more hypertrophy adaptations. Although maximal strength is the goal, if a trainee increases their muscle size and they are equally as efficient, then they will be stronger because they have more contractile tissue to recruit. So generally speaking, we want to accumulate volume at times when the trainee is focusing on hypertrophy, but high volumes in combination with heavy weights may cause excessive joint stress if performed for a prolonged time. So it may be smart to reduce volume at a time that you need to peak. Volume for hypertrophy adaptations are much more important and straightforward. As mentioned in the previous study, higher volumes directly cause greater hypertrophy. However, this result has also been verified more reliably in this meta-analysis. It was found that a dose-response relationship was found between weekly volume and hypertrophy. In other words, the more sets performed per muscle group per week, the more muscle they grew. However, most of the studies analysed in this analysis only use maximum volumes of around 10 to 15 sets. For most serious trainees, 10 to 15 sets is not an extremely high weekly volume. So although the research suggests that more is better, we don't know where the limit lies. I would assume that there would eventually be a point at which more volume provides very negligible additional hypertrophy, while increasing injury risk. So it is impossible to say how much volume is optimal for hypertrophy without more evidence. Although some good practical advice would be that if training sessions feel relatively easy and you were recovering well from each session, then more volume should be considered if hypertrophy is the goal. Let's now discuss the variable of load, or the relative amount of weight lifted for the exercise. This is a very important variable for strength training, as it directly determines how specific the exercise is. Since we are referring to maximal strength, the most specific load that can be used is lifting a 1 RM. The further we get from a 1 RM load, the less specific the exercise becomes, and the less transfer it will have to maximal strength performance. So although maximal loads are the most beneficial for maximal strength, a trainee will plateau or possibly get injured if these extreme weights are used continuously for an extended period of time. Therefore, it is probably best to periodize our training to use lighter loads further from when the trainee needs to peak, and heavier loads closer to when they need a peak. Even at distant times from the peak, the trainee should probably use loads no lighter than around a 10 to 12 rep max. Loads lighter than this will simply not be heavy or specific enough to positively transfer to 1 RM performance. While the loads used for strength training are highly important, the loads used for hypertrophy training are much more flexible. It is quite clear that hypertrophy can be achieved over a large spectrum of rep ranges. This meta-analysis showed that both heavy and light loads were able to achieve equal hypertrophy adaptations so long as each set was taken very close to failure. So practically speaking, rep ranges of anywhere between 6 and 20 reps can be used for muscle growth. The exact rep ranges we select may be based on a number of factors. The first is joint tolerance. For certain individuals, heavy loads may irritate certain joints, but lighter loads don't. So if a trainee has a specific joint issue with heavier loads, then lighter loads can be used instead with higher rep ranges. Next is the nature of the exercise. Generally speaking, compound lifts are better suited to heavier loads with lower rep ranges, and isolation exercises are better suited to lighter loads with higher rep ranges. For example, it may not be the best idea to perform very high reps on squats, since the trunk stabilizers and cardiovascular system may give out before the quads maximally fatigue. However, a leg extension may be better suited to be used with very high reps, since the fatigue is localized in the quads. And the last consideration is individual preference. Some people simply prefer using heavier or lighter loads for numerous reasons. For example, if a trainee has a simultaneous goal of increasing strength, then lower reps and heavier loads may be used on certain exercises. The next variable to compare is the proximity to failure. This refers to how close to failure the sets need to be taken to maximize adaptations. This is not as important for strength training as the absolute load lifted. However, when training for strength, sets should be taken to at least an RPE of around 6 to 7. This is because training with too many reps in reserve simply means that the load could be increased, and it is quite clear that heavier loads are more beneficial for strength training. Sometimes, strength trainees may want to intentionally leave a few reps in reserve at certain times throughout their training cycle in order to ensure high quality technique. It is often the case that taking a set too close to failure causes some breakdown in technique. This may be unwanted if a particular movement pattern is being trained. For hypertrophy training, the proximity to failure is much more important. This is more important when using lighter loads rather than heavier loads. Sets of 6 to 12 will already stimulate all motor units from the start of the set, and will tax all muscle fibers regardless of how close they are taken to failure. While sets of 12 to 20 won't stimulate all motor units until the slow twitch fibers have been fatigued. Therefore, these sets must be taken close to failure in order to ensure all muscle fibers have been recruited and taxed by the exercise. This research review recommends that lighter load should be taken to at least an RIR of 2, meaning that only 2 more reps could have been performed in the set. And the last variable to compare is training frequency. It needs to be understood that frequency is simply a product of total weekly volume. It is simply how we split our total amount of training over the week. So when we refer to different weekly frequencies, it implies that volume is equated. For strength training, moderate frequencies are probably the most beneficial. Around 2 to 4 times per week per strength lift is likely to be the sweet spot for most people. This is because higher frequencies allow more exposure to the motor pattern. The more frequent a skill can be practiced, the better ingrained it will become. However, very high frequencies may be a bad idea, as the body may not be fully recovered to perform well for certain heavy sessions. So enough rest should be given between sessions while still allowing a high exposure to the movement. A good way to practically implement this is to alternate heavy and lighter days in order to manage fatigue. So one session could be heavy and taken close to failure, while the next session could be lighter and taken further from failure. This will allow exposure to the movement while not fatiguing the trainee for the next hard session. For hypertrophy training, the frequency chosen doesn't matter to any significant degree, so long as the volume is matched. This meta-analysis showed that when volume was equated, training a muscle group 1 to 3 times per week made no difference to hypertrophy outcomes. So although the frequency itself doesn't matter, higher frequencies are a good way to increase training volume. A trainee may choose to increase their training frequency as a method of doing more sets for a certain muscle group. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.